The year was 1830, and the humid breath of a southern summer clung to the vast fields of Georgia's Red River plantation, where cotton rose and fell like waves of white burden under the sun. Here lived Isaac, a young enslaved man whose strength was spoken of in whispers, broad-shouldered, disciplined, quiet, and carved by labor from dawn until the last ghost of daylight. Yet strength in that place was both blessing and curse, for the overseer saw muscle as currency, and the master saw bodies as inheritance. Across the wide veranda of the plantation house, Edmund Harrow, a wealthy farmer with ambitions larger than his land, paced with a restless hunger. His daughter, the gentle and frail Miss Abigail Harrow, had returned from Savannah with no husband, no suitor, and no prospects in a world where women were traded like dowries. Her father, consumed by pride and lineage, made a decision that would stain the soil of that place forever. He would choose an enslaved man to give his daughter a child he imagined would be strong and dark, a legacy he believed would elevate his standing among men who measured worth in human shadows. Isaac did not know his name had already been chosen. Beyond the fields, the small cabins of the enslaved community breathed with quiet dread. Rumors traveled faster than wind, about the master's plan, about the girl's tears, about Isaac's fate being written without his voice. The nights grew heavier, the prayers louder, and the sense of something ancient and dangerous stirred beneath the stars. For here, in this broken land, the human heart still dared to resist, even when its chains rattled louder than its hope. The dawn that followed was slow and reluctant, as though even the sun hesitated to rise upon the burden of that morning. Isaac stepped from his cabin with the cool earth still clinging to his bare feet, breathing in the mist that curled along the ground like a quiet warning. The fields stretched before him in an endless expanse of pale blue light, the cotton still asleep in its shadows. He felt the tension in the air, the way the birds seemed muted, the way the wind carried whispers from cabin to cabin. Something was coming, and the land itself seemed to brace for it. As he walked toward the work line, the others watched him with the heavy silence of people carrying a truth they wished they could shield him from. Old Miriam, who prayed louder than the church bell on Sunday, placed a trembling hand on his arm and murmured, "Stand strong, child." She did not explain. She didn't have to. Isaac felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. He saw it in the glance of the overseer, sharp as flint, and in the way the master's house loomed brighter than usual in the rising sun, its windows like unblinking eyes. Even the horses tethered by the barn shifted nervously, their hooves scraping the dirt as though they, too, sensed the shift in the world. By midday, sweat clung to Isaac's skin, and the sky ripened into the deep gold of a summer afternoon. The overseer's whistle pierced the air, summoning him from the line. The sound sliced through the quiet rhythm of work, drawing every head upward. Isaac felt his chest tighten as he wiped his brow and stepped away from the cotton rows. Behind him, the others watched with the kind of helpless fear that had become familiar, fear for one of their own being pulled into the unknown. As he walked toward the house, the long shadows of the oak trees stretched across his path like dark fingers, reaching, warning, pleading. Every step felt like a surrender he had never agreed to make. The steps that carried Isaac toward the big house felt heavier than any burden he had ever lifted in the fields. Each footfall pressed into the earth with a slow, reluctant weight, as if the soil itself tried to hold him back. The sun glared fiercely above, bleaching the world in a blinding wash of heat that made the white columns of the house shimmer like distant ghosts. Isaac's breath grew tight in his chest, not from exertion, but from the thick sense of danger rising around him. A cicada droned in the trees, a long, steady hum that felt like the trembling of the world itself. As he neared the veranda, he could see Miss Abigail through the open doorway, her pale hands gripping the back of a chair, her posture stiff with a grief he could not yet name. Inside the house, Edmund Harrow waited with an air of cold satisfaction, the kind that belonged to a man who believed every life around him existed to bend before his will. His eyes studied Isaac with a calculating interest. as though evaluating a piece of livestock rather than a man with breath and memory. The room was thick with the scent of polished wood and pipe smoke, and yet underneath it lingered a quiet, frail despair. Abigail's despair. She stood behind her father like a fading shadow, her cheeks blotched with tears she kept trying to hide. Isaac's gaze met hers only briefly, but in that moment he saw a truth deeper than the master's command. She had not chosen this. She was trapped in a quiet cage lined with silk and sorrow, her father's will tightening around her like a rope. Edmund moved closer, his boots clicking sharply against the wooden floorboards, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. He circled Isaac as if inspecting him, speaking in a tone that made the blood run cold. "Strong," he murmured. "Quiet, disciplined, he'll do." Abigail flinched at the words, her shoulders trembling, her breath shallow. A storm of shame washed across her face, and she clasped her hands tightly as though holding herself together by force. Isaac stood still, spine straight, jaw locked, refusing to let his fear show, yet deep inside his heart hammered with a terrible rising truth. His life, his body, his future were no longer his own. The room felt smaller. With every passing second, the air thick and suffocating, pressing him toward a fate he could neither outrun nor fight. The hours that followed unfolded, with the slow, suffocating weight of a storm gathering its strength. Isaac was sent back to the quarters, but the world around him no longer felt familiar. Every cabin, every tree, every distant field suddenly seemed to watch him with solemn, knowing eyes. The news moved quietly among the enslaved, carried in whispers that trembled, like thin flames in a restless wind. Mothers held their children a little tighter, old men bowed their heads in long, silent prayers, and the younger laborers clenched their hands helplessly, fury and sorrow twisting in their chests. Isaac walked through it all with a hollow stillness, feeling the ground shift beneath him as though the earth itself recoiled from what had been decided in that house. His pulse thudded like a drumbeat warning of a danger that had no sound, no face, only consequence. Inside his cabin, the dusk settled like a heavy curtain, turning the room into a dim sanctuary of shadows. Isaac sat on the edge of his narrow cot, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly until the veins rose beneath his skin. His breath trembled in his chest as he stared at the wall, where a thin crack in the wood allowed a sliver of evening light to slip through. He followed its path with weary eyes, watching it stretch across the floor like a fragile thread of hope trying to reach him. Yet every time he grasped for calm, the memory of Edmund Harrow's cold appraisal returned. Those measuring eyes, that satisfied smirk, and the rage inside Isaac tightened like a fist, closing slowly around his heart. He felt trapped in a destiny carved by another man's hunger, a destiny that violated every boundary of his humanity. As darkness deepened, a soft knock broke through the quiet. It was Miriam, her wrinkled face haloed by starlight. When she stepped into the doorway, she looked at him as a mother looks at a son carrying too much sorrow to bear alone. Without speaking, she placed a trembling hand against his cheek, her touch warm, steady, filled with a strength older than chains. "They take our bodies," she whispered, her voice thick with grief. "But child, don't you let them steal your soul." Isaac closed his eyes, the words sinking into him like water into parched earth. Miriam prayed over him in a low, melodic murmur, words not meant to change the night, but to fortify the spirit walking into it. When she finally left, Isaac remained seated in the quiet, the prayer lingering like a fragile shield around him, holding him together against a world determined to tear him apart. Night crept over the plantation like a slow, watchful creature, its darkness thick and swollen with secrets that pressed against the walls of every cabin. Isaac stepped outside, drawing in the cool breath of the evening as though it might steady the turmoil roaring inside him. The moon hung low, a pale and trembling coin suspended above the treetops, casting faint silver strokes across the packed earth beneath his feet. Crickets sang in the tall grass, but even their song sounded muted, careful, as though the land itself feared waking whatever cruelty lay coiled inside the master's house. Isaac felt the weight of it, felt the way the shadows pooled like ink near the veranda steps. waiting for him with patient hunger. Each inhale carried the scent of pine and distant thunder, whispering that a night such as this would not pass quietly. The cabins behind him glowed faintly with the soft flicker of lamplight spilling through chinks in the wood, small trembling flames bravely holding back the dark. Inside those rooms, families whispered and held tightly to one another, knowing that one man's suffering had become the sorrow of the entire community. Isaac could almost hear their murmured prayers rising through the night air, winding themselves around the branches of the great oak tree that watched over the quarters like a silent witness. He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his palm against his chest as though trying to calm the storm of fear and fury pounding inside. But the truth pressed harder, the knowledge that he had no choice, no escape, no voice in a world determined to use him. He felt his soul stretching thin beneath the weight of what dawn would demand. Footsteps broke the quiet, soft, hesitant, almost fragile. When Isaac turned, he saw Samuel, a younger man from the quarters, lingering at the edge of the light. His shoulders were tense, his eyes swollen with a mix of helpless anger and grief. "Isaac," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a confession. He struggled for words, his breath shaking. If there was a way, any way, to stop this. But the sentence broke, caught on the jagged edge of reality they both understood too well. Isaac stepped toward him, placing a steady hand on Samuel's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through the young man's body. "We survive," Isaac murmured, his voice low, carved from the stone of centuries of endurance. "Whatever they take, whatever they force, we survive." Samuel nodded slowly, tears gathering in his eyes, and for a moment the two men stood under the moonlight, bound not by fate, but by the quiet, unspoken brotherhood of the oppressed. And in that stillness, a fragile flame of defiance flickered to life between them. Dawn approached slowly, dragging its pale light across the plantation, as if unsure whether to reveal what the night had decided. A thin veil of mist clung to the ground, hovering in ghostly ribbons above the earth, softening the edges of the cabins and blurring the distant outline of the big house. Isaac stood alone near the old oak, its branches stretching wide like the arms of an ancient guardian that had witnessed too many stolen futures. The stillness was almost unbearable, too perfect, too fragile, as though the world held its breath in the space between night and morning. His chest rose and fell with heavy, deliberate breaths, each inhale a plea for strength, each exhale a quiet surrender to the inevitable. Somewhere deep in the fog, the sound of a rooster fractured the silence, its cry ringing out like an omen. From the veranda, a lantern flickered to life, its trembling glow announcing the stirring of the master's household. The first worker to appear was Thomas, a servant from inside the house, carrying a tray of water with hands that shook more from dread than from the morning chill. He caught Isaac's eye briefly, just a flicker, just a heartbeat, but in that moment the truth passed between them like a whispered confession. "Today." Isaac felt the words settle inside him, heavy as iron. He turned his gaze toward the rising sun, its first rays painting the sky in streaks of gold, and rose, mocking the anguish that soaked the soil beneath his feet. As light slowly chased away the shadows, Isaac's thoughts drifted to his mother, long gone, but remembered in the lullabies she once hummed. Songs of endurance whispered on nights when freedom felt like a distant star. Behind him, the other enslaved workers began to emerge from their cabins, their faces drawn with sorrow, their footsteps slow and hesitant. No one spoke. Words were too fragile for a morning such as this. Instead, they surrounded Isaac in a quiet, trembling circle, their presence forming a shield made not of strength, but of love and shared suffering. Old Miriam pressed something into his hand, a tiny wooden cross carved by her late husband. "Hold this," she whispered, her voice trembling like a reed in the wind. "Not because it changes what men do, but because it reminds you who sees what they do." Isaac closed his fingers around the cross, feeling its smallness, its warmth, its quiet. Truth. As he looked up, he saw the overseer striding toward them, his shadow long, his expression cold. The world tilted quietly toward its cruel appointment, and with a slow, steady breath, Isaac stepped forward to meet it. The walk to the big house felt longer than it ever had, though Isaac had traveled that path hundreds of times. The morning sun had risen fully now, pouring its harsh gold across the fields, illuminating every grain of dust that drifted in the air. Yet the warmth did nothing to loosen the chill that clung to his spine. Each step he took sank deep into the soft, dew-soaked earth, the grass brushing against his ankles like trembling fingers begging him to turn back. The wooden cross Miriam had given him lay warm in his palm, the edges worn smooth by decades of other hands that had held on to faith when the world tried to strip it away. He clutched it tightly, as though it were a lifeline cast across a chasm he hadn't chosen to stand at the edge of. The morning stillness rang with the weight of unspoken prayers rising from the cabins behind him. As he approached the porch, he saw Miss Abigail standing behind one of the tall white columns, half hidden, as though she herself were a ghost, trapped inside the house of her own bloodline. Her pale dress fluttered slightly in the warm breeze, but her body remained motionless, frozen by dread. Her hands were clasped against her stomach, trembling with an agony she seemed too frightened to voice. Isaac's gaze met hers only for an instant, but in that fragile exchange he saw a reflection of his own pain, a mirrored captivity. She looked as though she wanted to speak, to warn him, to beg him for forgiveness for a crime she hadn't chosen, but fear held her voice hostage, and all she could offer was a single silent tear tracing a delicate line down her cheek. Edmund Harrow emerged from the doorway a moment later, his posture rigid, his expression set with cold authority. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent naturally to his desires, and in his eyes sparkled the twisted triumph of someone who had found a way to reshape the future using flesh that was not his to command. "Isaac," he said, with a tone too calm for the cruelty it carried, "this is a day of importance for my family and for you." His words struck the air with a cruel irony, tightening Isaac's jaw and stiffening his breath. He stood tall, refusing to bow his head, though inside his heart wept with the knowledge of what this man intended to forge at the cost of his humanity. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows behind the porch columns, the moment settled like a stone swallowed by deep water, inevitable, heavy, and devastating. The master led Isaac through the long, echoing hallway of the house, where polished floors reflected the light like a river of trapped sunlight. Each step Isaac took reverberated through the wooden planks, as though the house itself judged him for trespassing into a domain where his presence was allowed only through the cruel will of another man. The portraits lining the walls stared down at him, stern-faced ancestors with powdered wigs and hollow eyes carved by years of entitlement. Their painted gazes followed him, whispering silent accusations, as if blaming him for the sins their descendants were preparing to commit. The air was thick with the heavy scent of magnolia oil and candle smoke, carrying the faint sweetness of luxury, layered with the rot of deep, unspoken wrongdoing. At the end of the hallway stood a door Isaac had never crossed before, its frame adorned with elegant carvings and a brass handle polished to a mirror shine. Behind that barrier lay the master's intentions, the crushing future he had designed without a moment of mercy. Isaac felt his breath grow shallow as Edmund Harrow paused before it, turning to regard him with a look both calculating and triumphant. "What happens here is for legacy," the man declared softly, as though speaking of a business deal rather than the destruction of two human spirits. "My family will grow stronger from this day forward." Behind him, Abigail lurked like a fading shadow, swallowed by the dim light of the corridor, her eyes wide, her lips trembling, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. She looked as if her very soul were shrinking inside her. Isaac's pulse hammered against his ribs as Edmund pushed open the door with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a room drenched in the warm glow of morning. Sunlight poured through tall, sheer curtains, painting the space in soft gold, but the beauty of the light could not mask the suffocating tension that filled the room. A small table with a bowl of water and folded linens stood in one corner, placed there with cold preparation. Isaac felt the weight of the wooden cross still, pressed into his palm, its edges digging into his skin, as if trying to anchor him to something pure amidst the corruption. His throat tightened, his stomach clenched, and yet he held himself still, silent, composed, and unbroken. And in that moment, just before the door closed behind them, the world seemed to tilt again, as though history itself shuddered at what was being forced into motion. The room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against Isaac's chest from all sides. The curtains swayed gently in the faint morning breeze, their ghostly motion the only softness in a space thick with dread. Abigail stood near the window, her back partially turned, as though she wished she could melt through the glass and disappear into the sunlit fields beyond. Her fingers gripped the thin fabric of her sleeve so tightly that her knuckles shone white. Isaac saw her shoulders quiver with each breath, the quiet tremors of a woman trapped not just by her father's will, but by a world that gave her no power to refuse, no sanctuary to flee to. And though Isaac bore the heavier weight of the violation about to unfold, he could not ignore the quiet suffering etched into Abigail's trembling silhouette. Edmund Harrow lingered near the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floorboards like a dark stain. He spoke in a voice low and measured, the cadence of someone issuing instructions rather than acknowledging human fear. "This union," he said, "will secure a future my line has been denied for too long. Strength breeds strength." His words hung in the air with a poisonous confidence, each syllable cutting deeper into the fragile humanity of the two souls before him. Abigail's breath hitched, a soft, broken sound she tried to swallow, but Isaac heard it, felt it, as sharply as if it had been torn from his own chest. Harrow's gaze remained fixed on Isaac, assessing him not as a man, but as a tool, a vessel, an instrument carved for his ambitions. When Harrow finally stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him with a dull, fateful click, the silence shifted into something raw and suffocating. Abigail turned slowly, her eyes rimmed red, her breath trembling with a terror she tried desperately to hide. Isaac stood utterly still, the wooden cross pressed so hard into his palm it nearly broke the skin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sunlight washed over Abigail's face, catching on the wet shine of her tears, turning them into tiny sparks of helplessness. Isaac saw her lips part as if to speak, but no words came, only a soft exhale of grief. And in that fragile moment, two broken spirits looked at one another not as prisoner and jailer, nor victim and accomplice, but as human beings, standing on the edge of a cruelty neither had chosen. The room felt suspended in time, trembling with the weight of the unspeakable, and the world outside held its breath. The minutes that followed stretched into an unbearable stillness, as though the air itself resisted moving through the room. Abigail lowered her gaze to the wooden floorboards, her breath shallow and uneven, each one caught on the sharp edge of fear. Isaac could see the tremble in her hands, the faint quiver in her jaw, the way she clung to the thin fabric of her dress, as though it were the last barrier between her and a world intent on crushing her. Outside, the cicadas droned in a steady, mournful rhythm that seeped through the walls like a dirge, their ceaseless call echoing the helplessness coiled tight in both their chests. Isaac felt the weight of her suffering join the weight already suffocating him, two sorrows intertwining in a quiet, agonizing silence neither knew how to break. Slowly, Abigail took a hesitant step toward him, her small slippers brushing softly across the floor. She looked impossibly fragile, like porcelain forced to bear the weight of an anvil. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was no louder than a whisper carried on a trembling exhale. "I never wanted this," she said, each word sharp with shame, yet softened by a sorrow that belonged to a heart still capable of compassion. She pressed her palm to her lips as though trying to hold back a sob, her shoulders curling inward like a child bracing against a storm. Isaac felt the words strike him deeply, not because they changed the fate forced upon them, but because in that moment she ceased to be the master's daughter and became simply a woman, imprisoned by a cruel design she did not command. Isaac stepped back, not out of fear but out of reverence, as though giving her the space to reclaim even the smallest fragment of dignity. His chest tightened as he searched for words, anything to ease the aching tremor in her voice, but silence held him captive, the same silence that had bound him his entire life. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, opening his palm to reveal the tiny, wooden cross Miriam had given him, its edges worn smooth with generations of endurance. Abigail stared at it with wide, glistening eyes, as though seeing the first flicker of humanity in the suffocating dark. For a moment, the fragile line between them shifted, not man and forced participant, not captive and unwilling witness, but two souls standing on the precipice of a cruelty neither deserved. The sunlight caught the cross and cast a small, trembling shadow on the floor, thin, fragile, yet undeniably present, a reminder that even in the bleakest rooms, some trace of spirit could still refuse to die. The fragile stillness in the room thickened until it felt almost difficult to breathe. Abigail stared at the tiny cross as though it were a relic from another world, one untouched by cruelty, untouched by the weight of her father's ambitions. Her trembling fingers hovered near her lips, her breath breaking softly in her chest. Isaac watched her carefully, sensing the battle within her, the fear, the shame, the helplessness coiling through her like vines. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the shutters, making them creak in a slow, mournful rhythm that seemed to echo the ache in both their hearts. The golden morning light shifted as clouds drifted across the sun, dimming the room until shadows crawled along the walls like dark water. Abigail's voice came again, this time thinner, frayed at the edges. He thinks a child will save him from scorn. Her lashes trembled as she blinked back tears. But it is not his life being broken, it is ours. She pressed a hand hard against her chest as though trying to keep her heart from collapsing inward. She took another step toward Isaac, hesitant, uncertain, holding herself as if every movement cost her something precious. When her eyes lifted to his, they carried a plea so intense it nearly stole his breath. "I am not your enemy," she said softly, her voice shaking like a candle flame caught in draught. "I am as trapped as you are, though my prison has silk curtains instead of chains." The admission hung between them like a confession and a wound both. Isaac felt something shift deep within him as he listened, something quiet, ancient, and aching. Her words peeled away the last barrier of distance between them, revealing two spirits standing on opposite sides of the same blade. His throat tightened with the weight of everything he could not say, everything. He'd been forbidden to speak his entire life. Instead, he offered her the only gesture he possessed, a slow lowering of his head, a silent acknowledgement of her suffering alongside his own. Abigail's breath caught, and for a moment she closed her eyes, allowing herself a sliver of human connection she had long been denied. The faint breeze stirred again, brushing her dress, lifting a loose strand of her hair, and the room felt suspended in a fragile moment that neither cruelty nor command had the power to fully extinguish. Across the space between them, two broken lives stood trembling in the same light, bound not by choice, but by the unbearable weight of being human in a world that refused to see their humanity. The house seemed to hold its breath as a deeper quiet settled over the room, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to bend the walls inward. Abigail moved toward the window, her fingers brushing the sheer curtains as though desperate for something gentle to anchor herself to. Outside, the world looked almost peaceful, the sunlight glazing the fields, the breeze stirring the tops of the trees, the cotton rising in soft waves. But the peace was an illusion, a cruel disguise draped over a land that had learned to bury screams beneath its soil. Isaac watched her from where he stood, his heart thudding in slow, painful pulses, each beat echoing with the knowledge that the next moments would shape both their lives in ways neither could mend. Her shoulders rose and fell with a trembling breath, her frail frame outlined against the bright world she wasn't free to step into. When she turned back to him, there was a new expression on her face. Not strength, not defiance, but a fragile, trembling courage born from despair. Her voice shook as she spoke, but there was something fierce hidden beneath the tremor. "Isaac," she said, clasping her hands in front of her, "whatever happens in this room, I need you to know I never wished harm upon you." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she forced herself to continue. "My father sees me as property. To him, I am a name to be preserved. But you," she paused, her breath breaking, "you are a life he is trying to break for his own pride." A single tear slipped down her cheek, carving a fragile silver trail in the sunlight. The sight of it struck Isaac with a sorrow so deep it felt like a stone sinking to the bottom of his chest. Her suffering did not erase his, but it wrapped around his heart like a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them had chosen the cruelty tightening around their fate. Isaac stepped forward slightly, not close enough to frighten her, but close enough that she could see the truth in his eyes. The light shifted, casting a shadow across his face that made his expression seem carved from the very weight of centuries. He lifted the wooden cross once more, offering no words, only the silent promise that whatever happened would not be met with hatred from him. Abigail pressed her hand over her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. For a moment, time seemed to tremble, the world beyond the window flickering in soft gold, the curtains swaying like pale spectres, the very floor holding their shared grief like an echo. In that suspended heartbeat, they were not master and enslaved, not forced pairings in a legacy built on cruelty. They were simply two human beings standing before a darkness neither had the power to refuse, yet both feared with an ache that lived deeper than breath. The faint creak of a floorboard outside the room shattered the fragile stillness like a stone cast into still water. Abigail stiffened instantly, her breath catching in her throat as she glanced toward the door. The sound was followed by the low murmur of two male voices, one of them unmistakably Edmund Harrow's, the other belonging to the overseer, whose presence in the house was never a good omen. Their voices were muffled, but the tone carried through the wood, sharp, impatient, thick with expectation. Abigail's fingers trembled as she clutched the curtain behind her, her knuckles whitening with dread. Isaac felt his muscles coil in instinctive tension, every fiber in his body tightening, as though preparing for a blow he could not see. The sunlight wavered as a cloud passed overhead, throwing the room into a dim, uneasy half-light that made every shadow feel like an approaching threat. Abigail slowly turned from the window, and for a moment her composure fractured completely. Her shoulders slumped, her lips parted with a soft, broken exhale, and her eyes, wide, shimmering with fear, lifted to Isaac's with a silent plea. "Not yet. Please, not yet." She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, as though trying to steady the wild beating of her heart. The voices outside grew closer, footsteps shifting, the weight of expectation gathering at the threshold, like a storm swelling behind a door. Isaac felt that pressure crush against him, heavy and relentless. The wooden cross in his palm seemed to burn with the heat of every prayer ever carved into its grain. In the suffocating quiet, he closed his eyes just long enough to gather the remnants of his strength, the strength not of muscle, but of spirit, the kind passed down through generations who had endured horrors and still found ways to stand. When he opened his eyes again, Abigail was staring at him with a look that broke something deep inside him, not because it was filled with fear, but because it held an apology too heavy for any human soul to carry. Her lips trembled as she whispered, barely audible, "I don't want this to destroy you." Isaac breathed in slowly, the air thick and heavy in his lungs, his heartbeat echoing in his ears like a slow, solemn drum. The footsteps outside stopped. Edmund Harrow's shadow darkened the strip of light beneath the door. In that suspended moment, thin as a thread, fragile as a breath, Isaac and Abigail stood together in the quiet before fate forced its hand. The room felt smaller, the walls drawing inward, the world shrinking to a single, trembling truth. Whatever came next would mark them both forever. The door rattled once under Edmund Harrow's hand. Not a knock, but a warning wrapped in wood and authority. Abigail flinched as though struck, her breath catching in a sharp gasp. She tried, desperately, to swallow. The sound reverberated through the room, vibrating in Isaac's bones like the toll of a distant bell. The light filtering through the curtains dimmed further as the footsteps outside shifted, the overseer's boots scraping impatiently against the polished floorboards. Isaac felt the moment constrict around him, tighter and tighter, like a noose cinching inward with each passing heartbeat. The air grew thick, tasting of old wood and fear, and even the dust motes, suspended in the light, seemed to slow, hanging frozen in a world holding its breath for what would come next. Abigail stepped forward, barely half a pace, yet it carried the weight of her entire trembling spirit. She lifted one hand, as though reaching toward Isaac for strength she did not have words to request. Her fingers hovered in the air between them, fragile as a wilted stem, and Isaac felt the instinct to steady her, to cross the impossible distance and offer some fragment of comfort. But the invisible chains binding them held him still. Abigail's eyes shimmered with tears that clung stubbornly to her lashes, refusing to fall. "He will open that door," she whispered, her voice thin, fragile, threaded with dread. "And he will look at us as though we are nothing but pieces of his legacy." Her words struck the air with a soft, shattering force, because she knew, and Isaac knew, that nothing in the world frightened her father more than a future he could not control. Then, with a low groan, the door latch shifted. Isaac's pulse roared in his ears, louder than the metallic scrape of the handle turning. Abigail stiffened, pressing one trembling hand to the side of her throat as if trying to hold her voice and her terror inside. Isaac felt his fingers close more tightly around Miriam's wooden cross, its edges digging into his skin, anchoring him to something that refused to crumble, even as the world pressed its full weight against him. The sunlight behind Abigail framed her like a pale, flickering halo, and in that instant Isaac saw not a fragile daughter of a cruel man, but a soul caught in the same merciless snare as his own. And as the door began to open, spilling the overseer's shadow across the floor like a spreading stain, the last breath of silence dissolved, leaving only the heavy truth that nothing in that room would ever be the same again. The overseer stepped into the room with the stiff posture of a man, accustomed to enforcing another's will. His presence eclipsed what little peace had existed moments before, casting a heavy shadow that stretched across the floor like a dark tide. His eyes slid from Abigail, fragile, trembling, to Isaac, whose stillness was carved from something deeper than obedience. The overseer's gaze lingered on him with a mixture of suspicion and cruel expectation, as though daring him to resist what had been ordered. Behind him, Edmund Harrow appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold satisfaction. The faint rustle of his coat was the only sound he made, but his silence roared with authority. The atmosphere thickened until even the sunlight seemed to retreat, dimming beneath the weight of the intrusion. Abigail instinctively stepped back, her hand clutching the fabric of her skirt as though trying to fold herself into the smallest possible shape. Her father's gaze pierced her like a blade of polished ice, measuring her obedience, testing her fear, delighting in the ease with which he could command her world to crumble. "It is time," Edmund said, his voice devoid of warmth or humanity. "Legacy waits for no one." Abigail's breath trembled in her throat, her voice trapped beneath layers of dread. She did not answer him, could not, and the silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate. The overseer shifted his stance, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his weight, his presence a looming reminder that refusal was not an option afforded to either Isaac or Abigail. Isaac felt his pulse thundering beneath his skin, a heavy rhythm that matched the tremor in the wooden boards beneath his feet. The wooden cross burned hot in his palm, a tiny ember of faith clutched against an engulfing storm. His gaze lifted to meet the master's, not with challenge, but with a solemn, unbroken steadiness that Edmund Harrow did not anticipate. For the first time, the master's smile faltered. There was something in Isaac's eyes, something ancient, something unyielding, that disrupted the cold machinery of his plans. Abigail, catching this wordless exchange, felt a tear slip free and fall silently against her dress. In that instant, an invisible thread connected all three of them. The master fueled by pride, the daughter crushed by his desires, and the enslaved man standing on the edge of a fate he had never chosen. The room held them in a trembling balance, teetering between obedience and quiet spiritual rebellion. The air in the room thickened until it felt as though even the walls were straining beneath the weight of what Edmund Harrow demanded. He stepped further inside, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards, each step a cruel punctuation mark in a sentence neither Isaac nor Abigail had written. The overseer lingered near the doorframe, arms crossed, blocking the only exit with the silent threat of what disobedience would mean. Abigail stood, frozen, her breath shallow, her trembling fingers tangled in the folds of her dress, as if she wished she could vanish into the fabric itself. A faint tremor ran through the glass panes of the window, stirred by a rising wind outside, the world beyond stirring, restless, as though it sensed the injustice unfolding within these walls. Edmund's gaze drifted between Isaac and Abigail, his expression tightening with frustration at the hesitance in the room, the human anguish he refused to acknowledge. "Do not mistake this moment," he said, his voice low, sharp, and heavy with command. "This is not cruelty. This is necessity." The words landed like stones, each one erasing whatever hope Abigail might have clung to. Her father reached for her chin, lifting it with a cold, rehearsed gentleness that made her recoil despite herself. "You will uphold this family's future," he whispered. "And you," his eyes snapped to Isaac, "will provide strength where weakness has plagued my line." His tone left no space for refusal, no room for breath. The wind outside pressed harder against the window, rattling it like a subtle warning from the world itself. Isaac felt his heartbeat pound with the slow, heavy rhythm of a drum buried deep in the earth. The wooden cross in his palm seemed to pulse with quiet fire, anchoring him to a truth larger than this room, larger than the cruelty pressing in on every side. He did not lower his gaze as Edmund glared at him. He stood, tall, silent, carved from a dignity the master had never been able to crush. Something in that gaze unsettled Edmund, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before pride corrected it. Abigail, seeing the unbroken strength in Isaac's stance, drew in a trembling breath she had not been able to take moments before. For the first time that day, her shoulders lifted, not in defiance, but in a fragile reclaiming of self, a small breath of courage at the edge of despair. The room held, all three of them in a taut, trembling balance, and in that suspended moment it became painfully clear that though the master controlled their circumstances, he could not command their souls. A long, brittle silence settled over the room, stretching so tightly it seemed ready to snap. The wind outside rose in a low, trembling howl, brushing against the shutters like a warning carried from some distant, unseen place. Abigail stood very still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her father's command hovered in the air like a blade suspended above both their lives, cold and merciless. Isaac felt the weight of that moment press into him, thick, suffocating, and final, as though history itself had drawn a circle around the three of them, sealing their fates within its unyielding grip. The wooden cross pulsed like a heartbeat in his palm, warm with the ghost of every hand that had held onto faith through unspeakable darkness. He did not bow. He did not tremble. He only breathed, slowly, deliberately, anchoring himself in a dignity no master could erase. Edmund Harrow's expression hardened, his brows narrowing with irritation at their stillness. He was a man unaccustomed to resistance, especially in the quiet forms that offered no violence, yet challenged him all the same. "Enough hesitation!" he snapped, the edges of his voice cutting through the dim room like shards of broken glass. The overseer shifted and straightened, his boots scraping the floor as he prepared to enforce the master's will. But in that moment, something changed, subtle, fragile, and almost imperceptible. Abigail stepped slightly away from her father, her chin trembling yet raised a fraction higher than before. It was not defiance, not rebellion, but the faintest flicker of human refusal, a small, shaking refusal to surrender the last piece of herself. Edmund's jaw tightened, his pride stung by that tiny spark he could not fully extinguish. Isaac felt the shift as well, a ripple in the room, faint as a breath, yet carrying the quiet roar of something sacred. He closed his fingers around the wooden cross, its presence grounding him as he lifted his gaze to meet the master's. In that unbroken stare, there was no violence, no threat, no spoken challenge, only the ancient, unwavering truth of a man who refused to let his soul be shaped by another's cruelty. Edmund Harrow looked into eyes that did not yield, and for a brief, flickering heartbeat, he faltered. The wind rattled the shutters, the curtains swayed like pale spirits, and Abigail let out a soft, trembling exhale, as though the room had shifted just enough for breath to return. In that suspended moment, the power in the room bent ever so slightly, not toward victory nor escape, but toward the one truth oppression fears most, the unbroken human spirit.